have 3 presentations in this session. What I'd like to do is probably approximately half an hour for each presentation, including questions. And what we'll do is we'll do questions at the end of each presentation, rather than have questions collectively at the end. That way, if people need to go see other sessions, they can, or other speakers. So I'm going to be starting things off, and I'm going to be talking about diabetes, exercise, and some trial data. First of all, there we go. These are my disclosures. Most of my stuff, none of this really relates to this presentation. Most of it's just been for behavior change development. I should also introduce myself. I am at the University of Concordia University in Montreal, and at the CIUS NIM Hôpital de Sacré-Cœur as well. I'm also going to sort of break with protocol and just do all my acknowledgements up front and thank all the people. The collaborators on the left-hand side are people from Diabetes Canada, who I work with in developing the Canadian diabetes guidelines, and a lot of this is going to be reflected in this presentation. The group I work with at the Montreal Behavioral Medicine Centre, and then all of our funders and supporters, including Diabetes Canada. What I intend to do is just review the current Canadian guidelines on exercise and diabetes. They're relatively consistent with a lot of the other guidelines. Explore some of the evidence that supports these recommendations, and then I'm just going to touch upon the Look Ahead trial, which is probably the most controversial trial that we have in the context of diabetes and lifestyle intervention, so it would be remiss of me not to touch upon it at a conference like this, in a session like this. So for those who aren't diabetes researchers or don't know very much about diabetes, I'm just going to quickly go through a few slides on diabetes. We have 2 kinds of diabetes. Type 1 diabetes, which is generally considered to be the kind of diabetes that you have when you are that you're born with. It affects a very small percentage of the population, only 5%. And really, this is an issue about the body not producing enough insulin. Type 2 diabetes, which is generally diabetes that people develop over time. It's very heavily tied to weight and weight gain, and affects obviously 95% of the population. So most of actually what I'm going to touch upon is specific to type 2 diabetes, though the literature around exercise in type 1 is not too different. And this is an issue where not that it's about production of insulin, but it's the utilization and an inability to properly utilize insulin. And effectively what both of these mechanisms lead to is a lack of glucose and a lack of energy within the muscles. And then that causes all of the problems that are associated with diabetes. It's a very prevalent condition. About 30% of Canadians have diabetes or pre-diabetes, so they're just on the scale of getting it. Which counts for about a total of 3.4 million people currently living with diabetes. It costs about $14 billion. It accounts for 1 in 10 deaths. And if I take this away from Canada, and the other thing is that it's a growing problem. So this is just Canadian data tracking the prevalence over time. And you can see that there's almost a doubling of the prevalence of diabetes from 1998 to 2008. And that number keeps increasing. So it's a forever growing problem. It is unevenly distributed amongst the population. Especially type 2 diabetes, where clearly people, as they get into middle age and becoming a senior, have a much higher prevalence and probability of having diabetes. But what is also interesting is that it's a condition that is equally prevalent in men and women. Canadian data is not atypical. This is a problem across the world, and this just shows you the regions and the growth in the rates of diabetes. And what you can see is that in developing countries, this is a problem that is growing at a much faster rate than it is in the currently developed countries. So it's a pretty big issue. It affects a lot of people, and it will become more of an issue as we move forward in time. And obviously what this means is that most nations now have some form of guidelines around treatment and management of diabetes. Canada is no different. And what I've got here is the 4 evidence-based current recommendations around diabetes. There is a 5th, which is a consensus-based one, and so I didn't put that up here. And what I'm going to do is I'll just run through these quickly, but then actually go into the evidence that supports these. And so the first recommendation is that people with diabetes should accumulate a minimum of 150 minutes of moderate to vigorous intensity aerobic exercise each week. That should be spread out across the week, and you shouldn't go more than 2 days without doing exercise. And that 150 minutes is a pretty consistent message that I think you will see, not just within diabetes, but generally within most exercise guidelines. Most people and most countries, most chronic disease organizations are really sort of fixated around that number. In addition, people with diabetes should perform resistance exercise. It should be at least twice a week, preferably 3 times a week, and that should be in addition to the aerobic exercise. Importantly, that before starting a resistance program, that there should be some interaction with someone who is a specialist in delivering those interventions, so that you get the proper training for it. Number 3, people with diabetes should set specific physical activity goals, anticipate likely barriers to physical activity. This is all very good behavioral modeling stuff, and there's evidence to support that. And then the final point is structured exercise programs supervised by qualified trainers should be implemented where feasible. Okay, so I'm going to go through some of the evidence that supports these. This is what I'm going to do. I'm going to start by just showing you the evidence that there is a benefit of aerobic exercise in diabetes. It's a benefit of resistance exercise. We're going to look at supervised versus unsupervised, because that's quite often an interesting point of discussion, and then finally end with this question about requirement for 150 minutes. So a lot of the data that I'm going to pull upon comes from a meta-analysis that was published in 2011 in JAMA by NPIS, who is from Brazil, if I believe. And this is the evidence that we have to date. These were randomized controlled trials. And when you look at this, what you see is quite clearly a collective benefit of aerobic physical activity on hemoglobin A1C. So hemoglobin A1C is sort of a 3-month cumulative measure of blood glucose. And it's one of the key measures of diagnosis of diabetes, as well as management of diabetes. So people who have higher hemoglobin A1C are defined as having diabetes, and our number 1 treatment target to start with is try and reduce the hemoglobin A1C. And if you can reduce the hemoglobin A1C, people's diabetes is normally better managed. So this is a 0.73 reduction, which is equivalent to most of the medications that are out there to deal with this. Obviously, hemoglobin A1C is a critical point in diabetes, but diabetes unto itself leads to a whole series of problems, the most concerning of which is mortality, directly causal for certain deaths, and particularly cardiovascular deaths. And what I have here, this is not trial data. So the previous slide I showed you was the trial data where they've actually looked at aerobic exercise interventions versus non-exercise interventions. This is actually epidemiological data. But what this nicely demonstrates is that in those people that are physically active versus not physically active, so the highest quartile, lowest quartile, what you see is a benefit of physical activity over time for both all-cause mortality and cardiovascular mortality. So not only does physical activity seem to have benefits around hemoglobin A1C, this is aerobic exercise, but it also tracks onto mortality outcomes. If we we look at resistance exercise, first thing you'll notice is there's only a handful of studies that have been done in resistance exercise and diabetes. However, what has been done, once again, shows a positive benefit with about a 0.57 reduction in hemoglobin A1C. And what's very nice as well, there's a series of studies that have looked at combined aerobic resistance exercise, once again showing about a 0.5 reduction in hemoglobin A1C. So if I pull all of that together, what you'll see here is that aerobic exercise on the face of it would seem to be your best bang for the buck with a 0.73 reduction in hemoglobin A1C, but noting that that's 18 studies and there's 4 for resistance and 7 for combined exercise. And so the point estimates are a little smaller, but that may be a function of the fact we have a smaller number of studies. Overall, aerobic exercise and resistance exercise seem to be good for diabetes. That's the message. So this question of supervised versus unsupervised. So this is from the same NPIS article, and what they did as well was they managed to pull out all of the studies that have just looked at physical activity advice. Because there's obviously, as you can see here, quite a number of them where the only intervention is explained to people that they should be more physically active, providing them with information about how to be physically active, and then getting them to go off and do that. And what you see here is that there's actually no statistical improvement or clinically relevant improvement in the hemoglobin A1C in those studies. And so if we contrast advice only with aerobic exercise, you can see that obviously the benefit at this point in time seems to be solely with the supervised exercise. So that's the evidence to date. Now I think probably most of you will appreciate there's a whole series of issues that are tied to the advice only interventions and probably how they're engaging participants in getting them to do the physical activity, but that's another talk for another day. Okay, so I've gone through benefits of aerobic, resistance, trying to demonstrate and show you there that the supervised really is important versus unsupervised. Now I'm going to get to this question of guideline, physical activity. And my fundamental question here is, if it's 150 minutes, what's below that 150 minutes, and should we really care about it? The fundamental basis of the theory behind having a guideline which simply says 150 minutes is the target is this picture, right? So benefit is totally derived at the point that you get to the 150 minutes, and that in theory nothing before it really derives you benefit. Okay, and then you get this 150 minutes, and then great, everything is fantastic, and your level of risk reduces. Okay. However, I think most people who do anything with physical activity probably appreciate that the curve is not quite that straightforward, and it's actually much more like this. And really, there's things that we know more broadly. This is not specific to diabetes. This is a general point here. The greatest benefit, time and time again, that is demonstrated, especially within the epidemiological literature, is that your benefit, the greatest amount of benefit starts, oops, I think we're losing battery, no? Well. Oh, there it is, okay. So the greatest amount of benefit starts from doing nothing to something, okay? So the steepest part of this curve is at the very initiation of physical activity. Okay, and then really you get to the major improvements when you start really sort of getting around this kind of point here. I'm going to describe what that point is in a second. And this is data that has been explored. The most recent analysis included about 1 million people looking at this kind of data. And based on some of the early kind of work, the suggestion is that actually half the current recommended levels of physical activity can actually lead to significant health benefits. and that every little bit that you do really counts. For example, this is a study by which was published a couple of years ago. The point that's identified here is actually where recommendations are. So this is 150 minutes moderate to vigorous physical activity per year. What you'll notice is that actually the largest increase, or largest relative change, occurs at this point, which is half of the current recommendations. So it's approximately doing 75 minutes moderate to vigorous physical activity per week. And actually, if you draw this out, the optimal benefit, so where this starts to plateau, and really the true optimal, is about 3 times that. So it's about 450 minutes of moderate to vigorous physical activity. So to some degree, just based on this, the question of why 150 minutes is sort of thrown out there. Just as this is mortality data that they've looked at, and actually if you get people to start doing physical activity and get them to that half of the current recommendation level, you would gain about 2 years worth of life. That's what that estimates out to. So that's general data, but what about within the diabetes literature? So very nicely, Pierre did a sub-analysis of his data, and I apologize, this is in a supplement, so the quality of the graphs isn't great, so I'm just going to show you the big ugly picture, and then I'm going to pull out the key elements here. This is all the studies looking at those interventions that included physical activity of 150 minutes or more. And in that little fuzzy box, you see about a 0.89 reduction in hemoglobin A1C. But if you take those studies that actually have done less than 150 minutes of physical activity, aerobic physical activity, as part of their intervention, you actually still get a benefit. And if I blow that up so that you can see, first thing I'll say is, obviously, a 0.89 reduction is better than a 0.36 reduction, okay? And I also point out the fact that the confidence intervals don't overlap. So these are different. They're certainly different. But the less than 150 minutes is not nothing, right? There is a benefit to be derived there, okay? So at this moment in time, I can say that I'm part of the diabetes guidelines group in Canada. This kind of data, we're doing a lot around this to think about how we really should be pitching our guidelines and what really the messaging should be. You can also track this actually onto mortality data. Now once again, this is not trial data, this is epi data, and what you see is even more stark contrast is a benefit really going from inactive to actually doing something. So this is still moderately inactive to moderately active, so there is some benefit, but these are all overlapping levels. And in fact, here in this multivariate analysis for total mortality, there's no additional benefit being very active, though for cardiovascular mortality this still holds. So clearly, doing something is of benefit in the context of diabetes, both in terms of control through hemoglobin A1C, as well as actually outcomes, downstream outcomes of mortality. There you go. So how much exercise is enough? This is the famous, most exercise physiologists adhere to this quote quite rigorously: something is better than nothing, more is better than less. Or also beautifully put by Albert Hubbard, positive anything is better than negative nothing. And there's a very famous exercise physiologist who once said that the risk from doing nothing is by far greater than the risk from ever doing any exercise. So I think that's true. And actually it becomes not only a question of guidelines per se, but there's also important public health messaging that's tied to that too. There's a lot of work that's now started to be done to show that people are heavily dissuaded from even starting physical activity when you have guidelines that say you must achieve 150 minutes per week, versus a guideline that says it is optimal to have 150 minutes, but engaging in some physical activity gives you some benefit. So there's a public health issue that you have to think about in that context as well. Cool, so I'm doing pretty well. So I'm going to finish with a little bit more of a methodology spin on this, and to really look at this look-ahead trial. And it's a pretty impressive trial. It's probably to date the largest behavioral trial that has ever been undertaken. It was, and obviously published in New England Journal of Medicine, so this was not a shabby trial. It's really interested in looking at the impact of weight loss using a lifestyle intervention on major adverse cardiovascular events in overweight type 2 diabetic patients. The estimate, so if you go online, this was funded by the NIH primarily, you can find that they've got at least $20 million of funding to do this trial, and actually the informal estimates that I've heard is really it's closer to $100 million. So a lot of money was put into this. 16 centers in the US, over 5,000 patients randomized. The intervention, so this is the primary intervention arm. The focus was on reducing calorie intake, increasing physical activity. It was a counseling-based intervention. People met weekly for the first 6 months, and then they continued to meet throughout the intervention to the point where they were just meeting on a yearly basis. The comparison arm was not benign. Comparison arm was actually diabetes education, 3 times per year meeting for the first 4 years, and then reducing off of that. Follow-up was over 10 years, and as I said before, the outcome of interest was MACE. So here's defined as cardiovascular causes, death from cardiovascular causes, non-fatal myocardial infarction, heart attacks, non-fatal strokes, or hospitalization for angina. And as a little parenthesis, anybody that's cardiovascular work might sit there scratching their head as to why hospitalization for angina was included in this. One of the quirky things of this trial is that they started off with an expected event rate of about 3% per year. They got halfway through the trial and found out their event rate was 0.7% per year. So what they had to do was add hospitalization for angina as an additional component in their MACE halfway through the trial. So that already starts to flag something about some of the issues that are tied to this trial. So what are the results? Okay, the big drum roll, $100 million. What did we find? Nothing. Okay, but just if you weren't sure, they even blew up the bottom end of this to make it, just to check, is there any, no divergence. Okay, control, intervention, exactly the same. There is nothing going on here. So automatically this raises the question, this is a null trial, is this a failure of the hypothesis? Is it really that weight loss does not lead to reductions in MACE in patients with type 2 diabetes? Or is this a failure of the intervention? Is it actually a question about, was this the right kind of intervention? So I'm just going to walk through the intervention, just a few slides on this, and you'll see why this is important. So they had 2 primary behavioral targets. The first was a 7% reduction in weight from baseline versus control, and 175 minutes per week in physical activity. And so first of all, you kind of might scratch your head and say, why would you pick 175 minutes when even in the US the guidelines suggest 150 minutes? And their argument and justification for it was that when you add that extra 25 minutes per week, you do get sort of a notable jump in benefit. So based on the epidemiological data, that extra 25 minutes translates into a notable reduction in risk. So they set themselves some lofty goals. let's see if they met their lofty goals. So if we look at 7% decrease in weight from baseline, well, this is the intervention arm. Okay, and so on the face of it, if you look at this, they were at about 6%, and this is over the 10 years. Obviously, as you can imagine, after the first year, they had a very big reduction. So they got 8% reduction in body weight after the first year, and as most trials of weight loss go, it creeps up a little bit, and then funnily enough, sort of gets this kind of plateau at the end with a slight downward trend. But so, did they reach their target? 6 was almost close. The only problem was, this is what the control group did. Right? So when you actually look at what they achieved in that box there, it was an aggregate 4% loss in body weight. It was about half of what they were expecting. So step number 1, they didn't achieve their primary goal around weight. What about the 135 minutes? It's actually never been reported. So they have some 4-year data that already starts to show that I think about 20% of the intervention group are meeting the 175-minute recommendation. So, and that was a significant drop-off from 1 year, but they've never actually reported the data all the way out to the end of the study. So we have no idea how much physical activity these people are doing, but based on the 4-year data, I'm pretty sure it's very low, if not negligible. And so when you actually sort of pull apart this intervention, now remember the $100 million, right? So $100 million, you would think they felt very confident about the kind of intervention they were dealing with here. And so it's always a little bit disconcerting when you read what's in yellow here. The lifestyle intervention is modeled on. So in fairness, the predecessor to the Look Ahead trial is the diabetes prevention program, which without doubt has been the most successful behavioral intervention that we've ever had. It beat drug by a mile in reducing the probability of people with pre-diabetes moving on to diabetes. And this is the same groups. They took that intervention as their core basis, and then they threw everything else on top of it they thought might work. That's effectively what they've done here. And you'll see this under there. It says the intervention utilizes strategies that have been shown to be most effective for long-term weight loss and weight loss maintenance. None of this was actually piloted in this kind of population, and none of it was actually ever tested in any way, shape, or form. And so I always sit there and I'm like, if you're going to spend $100 million of public money, you'd like to think you might spend 500,000, maybe $1 million, just making sure your intervention was a good intervention. It was going to at least do what you thought it was going to do. But that's just me. So the question there is really, is this a failure of the hypothesis? So do we really believe, based on this study, that weight loss has no impact whatsoever on outcomes in patients with diabetes? Or is it really that this was an undercooked intervention that wasn't really well thought out and that maybe was inappropriate for that population, including a very ambitious physical activity target that's not consistent with any guideline data? So, to wrap up, so that was my methodological rant, just to say. So what did I talk about? So benefits of aerobic exercise in diabetes. Aerobic exercise is good for patients. Resistance exercise is good, but maybe not as much as aerobic at this point in time. Supervised is certainly better. And the requirement for 150 minutes, I think that is an ideal that, may be fine to work towards, but actually in reality, I come back to something is better than nothing and more is better than less. So when you're out there counseling patients who have diabetes, getting them to get moving is critical step number 1, and then go from there and build from there. Shameless plug right at the very end here. I'm responsible for IBTN, and IBTN is a partner to SEPS in delivering this conference. We also have our own conference in Montreal in 2018. Montreal is lovely in May, so please do come. Thank you.